In today's video, I'll talk about my interview prep checklist, touching on the main milestones that you would want to take into consideration going into an intense interview, all the way from the moment you received an invitation for an interview to immediately after that milestone. But let's begin with the assessment step over this. So this first step of doing an assessment is something that many people overlook, especially some points in this process. The first thing you must do, you must search the intel for the company. Now, what I mean by intelligence, I mean mission, vision, core principles, values, and so whatever that company advertises as their mantra. Then you could also investigate for some of the most commonly asked questions in their job interviews, and you don't have to go too specific here. You just want to get a feeling of what's it like to interview there at that company, because many companies have specific sets of questions that they prefer asking in their job interviews. And of course, make sure that your point of contact is giving you enough information about this. Although I would add a question mark, add a little asterisk here, like not to insist too much to get as much information as possible from a main point of contact, because what I noticed over time is that the more you push them, the more unreliable the information they provide you becomes. So to give an example, if you push them too much to give you examples of possible questions in the interview, they will simply get questions out of their memory or whatever they think could be suitable for your role, which is not the best possible approach. So keep that in mind. I just ask once, and if they don't, they don't. But the more interesting part of doing the assessment is assessing yourself. Like what you're good, but more importantly, what you can really improve on for that specific job interview. And don't be surprised if it takes you a couple of days to figure out what you know and what you don't know going into interviews. For example, some people are really good speakers. They enjoy talking all day long, but then it means their preparation should be on, really finding their content, remembering all their experiences, so on and so forth. But the assessment part, you want to really find out your gap. What's that one thing that you really must improve on to nail this interview? And what's also important is that many people don't know how much time, or underestimate often the time required versus the time they have to invest. So if you know how much time you'll have to invest into this process, then you know how to adjust and to eventually build up a plan for this interview process. The second step you want to take into account for your prep process is the actual preparation, where you actually start producing content yourself. And this, depending on what type of interview you're preparing for, this could take days, weeks, or even months. For example, you're more likely to spend days to prepare for a phone interview, whereas you're more likely to spend months for an intense on-site interview for your dream job. And it's not uncommon for me to hear from people preparing for 6 months to get jobs with high-performing companies. Now, what is an algorithm that you want to consider here? The first one would be, especially if you're not good at interviewing and you have a little bit more time, you would want to prepare stories. Stories are what will enrich your experience to an extent that you will hopefully gain enough confidence to give your best story whenever asked for a question. These stories, basically, how do you find stories? Now, simply by looking in your CV. Looking in your CV will give you the most interesting experience from your career, and that would be a starting point. And I would even encourage you to start writing down those stories. Maybe some people prefer to make them in bullet points, although I believe that's a bit superficial. Most people prefer to do it in half a page narrative format that's concise but contains the more interesting information, while others prefer to write an entire page about that story. Now, you could also start by writing 3 pages of one story and then compressing it further, but the point is that you want to write them down to have them for later on in the process, and I'll touch upon this one as well later. The second point you wanted to touch upon here is to answer questions. So once you have your story building done, and this could take anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks, you should start answering those questions. Now, when you answer questions, those questions might not only be behavioral or might not only be technical, they're also the general types of questions. Tell me about yourself, or what's your strength, what's your weakness, why do you want to work for this company? These are, questions that anyone should prepare going into any possible interview. Now, of course, there's also the behavioral and the situational and the technical question, all else. But the idea is that you want to separate these first and second stage. Like, aside from preparing stories, you should also answer these questions. Most people prefer to do this in writing, or I should say, not in writing, but as a conversation. But even if you do it in writing as a separate step from the stories building process, that's still fine, especially if you have time here. The third step you want to do in your actual preparation process is to role play. A role play is very important, especially for technical roles where you're not supposed to be a great storyteller. So by communicating with someone, ideally, of course, with a friend, or I also have a free service on my website to find someone to role play with. But also, you could do this in the mirror, or you could record yourself. And the idea is to listen very carefully to how you're talking and whether if you make sense or not. Then, of course, last but not least, you should repeat all these steps until you feel like you're really good at what you're doing. And in this, how do you decide to repeat or not? It's again self-assess, and self-assess regularly. The best candidates I know are also the ones that are the best at self-assessing themselves, right? Oftentimes people don't know what they should prepare on. So you should really understand on whether your problem is that you don't have enough story, or your problem is that you cannot really communicate those stories. Oftentimes the quality of the story trumps the role play, but there are different scenarios here. So these would be the steps you would want to take for the preparation process. And again, it very much depends on how much time you have to invest in this process, and of course how much time you actually need to become efficient with these things. Now, say you're 3 days before the actual interview. Here are some things you want to keep in mind. The first is, of course, questions for them. And don't prepare just any questions for them. Try to prepare a list with 10 best questions that you might want to ask them. Try to even find out who will be interviewing you, and maybe look at their interests. And I also have a ton of lists with questions for them on my YouTube channel if you're interested. Then the next thing you want to do is to refresh your memory. Refresh your memory. Remember when I told you to write your stories down, to write your memories down in such a way that they're easy to reference later on. Now, this is your time to take advantage of those lists. And some of the best candidates take 5 minutes to refresh 20 stories that they previously prepared. Of course, you want to go again through the more interesting questions to ensure that you have the proper answers for them. And last but not least, refresh your memory on the mission, vision, core principles that company has. I do not recommend memorizing them, but if you read them 10 times, you will automatically understand and you'll remember more than you will otherwise do. Then, stable connection. Now, especially in today's rather special times where all interviews are held remotely, you should ensure that you have a pretty stable connection, and you should also make a quick test over how you sound, or whether if your sound works at all, and install the necessary software. Or if you're having a phone interview, it is unfortunately all too often that the phone line doesn't work as it should, and the interviewer has a hard time to understand you. So it's in your interest to be well understood. So that's why I would encourage you to find an area of your house where the connection is very stable for this. But this is something you would want to also keep in mind. Like, don't exaggerate with these things, but it's still important. And last but very important, keep yourself motivated, because I've seen countless candidates who are really exceptional candidates. Like, they have impressive CVs, And I felt, like they were losing motivation as they were going through the prep process. And interviewing is especially the actual interview is a very taxing experience. So that's why you want to ensure that you keep yourself motivated. I have a little bit of content on my channel related to this, but I will hopefully be able to read more about it, to create more content on this. But keep in mind this, and think about, brainstorm a little bit what's the best way for you to stay motivated going into this rather intense experience. Now, during the actual interview, I understand that interviews are very different by company and by position, and even by the time that you're interviewing. But still, there are some pieces of advice that I found very relevant here. The first one, and probably the most important one, is to listen. Like when I say listen, I'm actually telling you that if you understand what they're actually asking you, you will always get the job. Or at least you won't get the job, but you're not the best fit for the job, in which case you wouldn't be interested in the first place in getting this role. But listening is something that it's again a very important factor in a successful interview. The second thing, always give your best answers. Like I never expected this to be such a thing when I started talking to various candidates, but I realized over time that candidates were keeping their best answers for later on in their interviews. No, in my opinion, it's always give your best answers always. And if you think you'll have to use the story again for whatever other question, you could eventually repurpose the story, or you could ask your interviewer, hey, I already used this story, this would be my best story. Is it fine to talk about this one more time, or do you have another question for me? Because most often they do have a ton of questions that they can ask you for this. Number 3, cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic is, I always advise people to be optimistic in a job interview, but being overly optimistic is not only risking to paint a picture that you wouldn't want to over your profile, but the real danger here is that you will get too comfortable and you'll get too agreeable during that interview. So cautiously optimistic is something I always recommend to everyone throughout an interview, being a telephone or an on-site or a virtual on-site interview. And last but not least, have backbone during an interview. Like, times have changed. Interviewers and employers are no longer looking for people who agree with them on everything. So employers are looking, for candidates who have a certain amount of backbone and can lead the conversation and are true leaders in themselves, even if you don't have direct reports in your role, but you must show leadership throughout the conversation. So these would be the main elements you would want to keep in mind, going into an intense interview. And just quickly here, after the interview, a couple of elements to keep in mind. After an interview, I always recommend candidates to do a post-mortem. What do I mean by this? I mean to really take their time to refresh their memory on what questions were they asked and how they actually answered those questions. It also helps to write them down. Reason for this being is the number one complaint that candidates have is they don't know why they were rejected or why they were accepted in a job interview. And if you do this post-mortem, if you refresh your memory on everything you've said during the interview, and by rethinking through your answers and your performance, you will be able to very accurately assess your performance during the interview. This is especially important for companies that do not provide any feedback on why they rejected you, for example, Amazon, but also very interesting for companies that do provide you with feedback on why they rejected you, such as Apple, for example. But even if they do provide that feedback will most likely be very vague. So by connecting, you must connect as many dots as possible after the interview to know how it really went and how you perform and where you could have done better after all. Because interviewing is not a one-off thing. Like, even if you get the job, like 2 years later or 5 years later, you're going to have to interview again. And if you have a strong basis, strong foundation, you will actually be able to make this an incremental process over time. Second thing, thank you notes. Like thank you notes are something, you know, some candidates prefer, some others don't. Maybe look up online whether how's the tradition going with that company and whether they appreciate it. But something you definitely want to keep in mind. Number 3 here, wait, don't follow up after 3 days. Hey, did I get the job or not? Or even after 1 week. That's not going to help you. Why am I saying this? Because the next step after, you know, the interview is hopefully going to be the negotiation process, the salary negotiation. Whereas if you just push them over and over again, like, hey, how's it going? Did you deliberate what's going on? Chances are you won't go with an upper hand in your salary negotiation process. So I'd very much encourage you to just wait until they get back to you, or, you know, have your other interviews, of course, lined up ideally. So these would be the main elements you would want to keep in mind preparing and going through an intense interview. I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.